Today's story is called The Old Library Card Mr. Ellis Forgot He Had. Welcome to Warm Life Stories. If you enjoy gentle stories like this, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's begin. It was a quiet morning, the kind that didn't rush anyone along. The air rested gently on the street, cool but not cold, as if the night had only just stepped aside. A soft light slipped through the trees and settled on the porch rail, thin and patient, like it had nowhere else it needed to be. Mr. Ellis sat in his usual chair on the right side of the porch. He always chose that one. No particular reason. It just felt right after all these years. In his hands was a chipped mug, the same one he used every morning. He wrapped his fingers around it slowly, letting the warmth move into his palms. The steam rose in a thin line, then disappeared before it reached his face. Some mornings felt heavier than others. This one didn't. It felt quiet in a way that allowed breathing. A bird landed briefly on the porch rail, tilting its head as if considering something important, then fluttered away without a sound. The house behind Mr. Ellis remained still, holding on to its own memories, not asking to be opened just yet. He took a slow sip and looked out at the yard. The maple tree stood steady, its leaves barely moving, as though even the wind had decided to speak softly today. Mr. Ellis wasn't thinking about much, at least, not anything he could name. His thoughts drifted the way they often did. Not toward regret, not toward longing, just toward the gentle passing of time. The street across from him was quiet too. No cars, no voices, just the faint sound of someone opening a window somewhere down the block. He liked mornings like this. They didn't demand explanations. They didn't remind him of what was missing. They simply arrived and stayed a while. Mr. Ellis adjusted his glasses and leaned back slightly, the chair giving a familiar creak beneath him. He had grown used to that sound. It told him he was exactly where he was meant to be. Inside the house, the clock on the wall didn't tick anymore. It hadn't for years. He never fixed it. Some things, he believed, didn't need to keep moving to still matter. The light shifted just a little, touching the edge of the porch floor, then resting near his shoes. Dust moved lazily through the air, visible only because the sun had decided to notice it. Mr. Ellis exhaled slowly, the way someone does when they realize they don't have to be anywhere else. This morning felt complete somehow, not because anything special was happening, but because nothing was. And yet, without knowing it, something small was already waiting for him. Not outside, not in the yard, not even in the quiet of the street. It was waiting patiently, tucked away, unbothered by time, ready to be remembered when the moment felt right. For now, the morning stayed exactly as it was, soft, unhurried, and gently holding its breath. After a while, the morning continued on without asking anything from him. Mr. Ellis finished his tea and rested the mug on the small wooden table beside his chair. The table had a faint ring on its surface, left behind years ago by another cup, on another morning much like this one. He never bothered to sand it down. Some marks felt earned. He sat there a bit longer, listening. The sound of a lawn sprinkler clicked on somewhere down the street. A screen door opened and closed. Life, moving quietly around him, the way it always had. Most days followed a similar rhythm now. Not boring, just familiar. And familiarity, he had learned, carried its own kind of comfort. He rose slowly from the chair, steadying himself with one hand on the porch rail. His body had learned patience before his mind ever did. Inside, the house welcomed him the way it always had, cooler, dimmer, and calm. The living room held its usual stillness. An old sofa, a folded blanket resting neatly on one arm, a framed photograph on the shelf, dusted often but rarely moved. Mr. Ellis glanced at it as he passed, offering a small nod, as though acknowledging an old conversation that didn't need words anymore. He moved into the kitchen and rinsed the mug, setting it upside down on the towel to dry. The radio sat on the counter, silent. He hadn't turned it on yet. There was time for that later. Late mornings were for small tasks. He stepped back outside, slipped on his worn shoes, and walked toward the rose bush near the fence. Maggie had planted it years ago, insisting it would catch the afternoon light just right. She had been correct. It always did. Mr. Ellis bent carefully, checking the soil with his fingers. It was still damp from yesterday's watering. Good enough. He straightened, brushing his hands together slowly, then stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Routine had a way of keeping him grounded. Water the roses, check the mail, fix whatever small thing had come loose during the week. None of it was urgent. All of it mattered. The mail slot clicked softly behind him. He turned, surprised at how quietly the sound carried. 3 envelopes slid onto the floor. He picked them up, sorting through them without much interest. Utilities, a flyer, nothing unexpected. Mr. Clark, the mailman, waved from the sidewalk. Mr. Ellis lifted his hand in return, their shared ritual complete without a single word spoken. By late morning, the sun had climbed higher, changing the shape of the shadows in the house. Mr. Ellis returned inside and opened a narrow drawer in the hallway. Inside were things he reached for, often pens, a notepad, a loose button he meant to sew back onto a sweater. He took out the notepad and flipped through a few pages. Grocery reminders, short lists, a name written once, then crossed out gently, as if the pencil itself had hesitated. He closed the pad and placed it back where it belonged. There was comfort in knowing where things were, in knowing what the day would hold. Even the quiet parts felt dependable. At noon, he made himself a simple lunch soup, warmed slowly on the stove, eaten at the small kitchen table by the window. Outside, a breeze stirred the leaves of the maple tree. Inside, the spoon moved in an unhurried rhythm. Mr. Ellis wasn't waiting for anything, not really. But beneath the steady routine, there lived a soft awareness, one he rarely put into words. A sense that life, even now, still held small corners he hadn't walked into yet. He finished his lunch, rinsed the bowl, and dried his hands carefully. The afternoon stretched out before him, open and unremarkable. And somewhere within that ordinary stretch of hours, something quietly waited to be found. The afternoon settled into the house quietly, without ceremony. Mr. Ellis stood for a moment in the hallway, hands resting loosely at his sides, as if he were listening for something he couldn't quite hear. The light from the living room window reached only halfway down the floor, stopping just short of where he stood. He turned toward the small wooden cabinet near the wall. It wasn't anything special, just a narrow piece of furniture he'd owned for as long as he could remember. Its surface held a thin layer of dust, the kind that came not from neglect, but from time passing gently. He knelt with care, one knee touching the floor, and pulled open the bottom drawer. It resisted at first, just a little, as though surprised to be needed again. Then it slid forward with a soft, familiar sound. Inside, things rested exactly as they had been left. Old envelopes, a folded instruction manual for something he no longer owned, a handful of paper clips tangled together, photographs tucked inside a yellowing envelope, their edges worn smooth. Mr. Ellis did not reach in right away. He let the drawer stay open, allowing the air to move through it, as if the contents needed a moment to wake up. One by one, he lifted the items out and placed them gently on the floor beside him. Nothing hurried him. There was no reason to rush. He paused over the photographs, sliding just one halfway out. A familiar face smiled back at him from another time. He returned it carefully to its place, not ready to stay there too long. Near the back of the drawer, beneath a stack of folded papers, something thin caught his eye. A small rectangle, faded, flexible with age. He pinched it between his fingers and drew it out slowly. A library card. The corners were rounded now, softened by years of being carried and forgotten. The ink had lightened, but the name was still clear. Harold B. Ellis. Below it, a stamp marked with a date, from a lifetime ago. Mr. Ellis turned the card over in his hand, his thumb tracing the edge without thinking. It felt lighter than he expected, almost fragile. He couldn't remember the last time he'd held it, or when he'd placed it there. Only that, once upon a time, it had belonged in his wallet, slipped behind something else, ready to be used. He closed his eyes briefly. The quiet of the house seemed to deepen, as though it, too, recognized the moment. Libraries had always been places of comfort for him, warm in the winter, cool in the summer, quiet without being lonely. He remembered the way the wooden tables felt beneath his palms, the soft thud of books being returned, the way time slowed when he stepped inside. Mr. Ellis let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He sat back on his heels, the open drawer still between him and the afternoon light. For a moment, the years folded inward, bringing something close that had been very far away. He wasn't sad, just still. He placed the library card carefully on the floor beside him, separate from the rest of the drawer's contents. It didn't feel like it belonged back there anymore. After a while, he gathered the other items and returned them to the drawer, sliding it closed with a gentle push. The cabinet stood quietly again, keeping what it was meant to keep. Mr. Ellis remained there on the floor a moment longer, the card resting near his knee, as the afternoon light shifted once more. Some things, he realized, don't disappear when we forget them. They simply wait, patient and unchanged, for the right hand to find them again. Mr. Ellis held the library card for a long while without moving. It rested lightly in his palm, as though it might slip away if he didn't pay attention. The surface was smooth now, worn down by years of quiet use, or perhaps by years of waiting. He turned it over again, slower this time. The date stamped near the bottom caught the light briefly, then faded back into the soft shadow of the hallway. That had been a different season of life. Not better, not worse, just fuller in a way that had felt endless back then. He remembered walking into the library on warm afternoons, the cool air meeting him at the door, the gentle hush that followed, not forced, but shared, as if everyone inside had agreed to treat time with care. There had been a rhythm to those visits, the creak of the wooden floor, the quiet shuffle between shelves, the soft sound of pages turning somewhere nearby. And there had been laughter too, kept low out of respect for the place. Mr. Ellis could almost see it now, the way sunlight filtered through tall windows, landing in long rectangles across the reading tables, dust floating through the beams. Unhurried, he remembered sitting beside someone once, close enough to share the table, far enough to let silence do most of the talking. 2 books open, 2 cups of coffee growing cold. They never rushed there. There was no need. Sometimes they read, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they simply sat, content to exist in the same quiet space. The card had lived in his wallet back then, slipped behind a folded bill, easy to reach when it was needed. It was a small thing, easy to forget, easy to replace. And yet, here it was, still bearing his name, still remembering him. Mr. Ellis shifted slightly on the floor, stretching his legs out in front of him. The card rested against his knee now, a simple object carrying more weight than it should have. He thought about the last time he'd used it, or tried to. The memory wasn't sharp, just a feeling of walking out into daylight with a book tucked under his arm, the sense that he had all the time in the world. Somewhere along the way, life had grown louder, busier, then quieter again, in a different way. The library visits had slipped out of his routine without protest. There had always been reasons: work, home, days that filled themselves before he noticed. He had meant to go back, he always had. Mr. Ellis traced the edge of the card once more, then smiled faintly, not at the memory, but at himself. It wasn't regret he felt, just recognition. The house around him remained still, as though allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace. Outside, a car passed, then disappeared down the street. Inside, the past and present rested side by side. The library card wasn't calling him anywhere. It wasn't asking for anything. It was simply reminding him of a part of his life that had loved quiet places, of a man who once believed that an afternoon with a book was reason enough to leave the house. Mr. Ellis let out a soft breath and carefully closed his fingers around the card. Some lives, he thought, don't vanish when routines change. They wait, tucked into drawers, folded into memory, waiting for the day someone finally pauses long enough to remember who they once were, and who they still might be. Mr. Ellis didn't decide anything right away. He stayed where he was, the library card resting in his hand, as the afternoon light crept slowly across the floor. There was no sudden thought, no clear plan forming in his mind, only a quiet awareness that something had shifted, just enough to be felt. He rose carefully, brushing his palms against his trousers, and carried the card into the kitchen. He placed it on the table near the window, where the light fell softly, as if it belonged there. For a moment, he stood looking at it from a distance. It would have been easy to return it to the drawer, to tell himself it was simply a memory, something pleasant, but finished. That was often how these moments ended. Instead, he reached for his jacket. The movement surprised him slightly, not because it was difficult, but because it happened without much debate. His hands knew what to do, before his thoughts had time to interfere. The jacket smelled faintly of clean fabric and old air. He slipped his arms through the sleeves, then paused to check the pockets out of habit. Keys, wallet. He picked up the library card again, held it for just a second, then tucked it carefully into the wallet, sliding it into a side pocket where it would stay flat. Mr. Ellis didn't tell himself he was going anywhere special. He didn't even say the word library out loud. He simply put on his shoes and stepped onto the porch. The afternoon greeted him quietly. The street was brighter now, but still calm. A few leaves stirred near the curb. Somewhere, a radio played faintly behind a closed window. He locked the door, turning the key with the same steady motion he'd used for years. Then he stood there for a moment, looking down the street in both directions. The walk wouldn't be long. He knew the way without thinking. Once, he could have taken it with his eyes closed. He started down the sidewalk at an easy pace, not pushing himself, not slowing more than necessary. Each step felt familiar, even if the reason for taking it felt new. As he walked, he noticed small things he usually passed without thought. The uneven edge of the pavement, a mailbox with peeling paint, a child's chalk drawing fading near the corner. Life hadn't changed much since the last time he'd walked this way. If anything, it felt like it had been waiting. Mr. Ellis adjusted his glasses and breathed in deeply. The air carried the scent of cut grass and something warm. Bread, maybe, from a nearby kitchen. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't excited. He felt steady. At the corner, he paused, letting a car pass before crossing the street. The sun rested on his shoulders, comfortable and light. For years, his days had been shaped by habit, reliable, predictable. There was nothing wrong with that. But now, as he continued walking, Mr. Ellis understood something gently but clearly. Sometimes, a life doesn't need a big change. Sometimes, all it asks for is a small step taken, on an ordinary afternoon, in the direction of something once loved and quietly remembered. The library stood exactly where it always had, not grand, not impressive, just quietly present. Brick walls warmed by years of sunlight, wide windows reflecting the slow movement of clouds above. Mr. Ellis stopped just outside the entrance. For a moment, he simply looked at the door. The glass was clean, the handle polished smooth by countless hands. Nothing about it suggested urgency. Nothing asked him to hurry. He pulled the door open and stepped inside. The air changed immediately, cooler, still, carrying the familiar scent of paper and polished wood. The sound of the street faded behind him, replaced by something softer, a shared quiet, gently held. Mr. Ellis stood near the entrance, allowing his eyes to adjust. The library hadn't changed much. The shelves were taller now, perhaps, or maybe he was simply shorter. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, resting in long shapes across the floor. A few people sat scattered among the tables, heads bent, pages turning, each absorbed in their own small world. He walked forward slowly, his steps measured, respectful, as though the space itself asked for care. At the front desk, a woman looked up and smiled. Not the kind of smile that questioned, not the kind that rushed, just a gentle acknowledgement. "Good afternoon," she said quietly. Mr. Ellis nodded. "Good afternoon." He reached into his wallet and removed the library card, holding it between his fingers for a brief second, before placing it on the counter. "I'm not sure," he said, choosing his words carefully, "if this still works." The woman picked it up and examined it, turning it over with interest rather than concern. Her expression softened. "Well," she said, "let's see." She typed something into the computer, the sound of the keys, light and steady. Mr. Ellis waited, his hands folded loosely in front of him. Around them, the library breathed quietly. After a moment, the woman looked up again. Her smile widened just a little. "It's still active," she said. "You're all set." Something in Mr. Ellis's chest loosened. "Oh," he replied softly. "I see." She slid the card back across the counter toward him. "Welcome back," she added, as if he'd only been gone a short while. Mr. Ellis picked up the card, his fingers curling around it with care. "Thank you," he said. He moved deeper into the library then, passing familiar sections. Fiction, history, a long row of biographies. He didn't head anywhere in particular. There was no need. He ran his hand lightly along the edge of a shelf, feeling the smooth spines beneath his fingertips. Some titles stirred recognition. Others waited quietly, patient and unread. At one of the tables near the window, he paused and sat down. The chair pulled out easily, as though it remembered him. Mr. Ellis rested his hands on the table and looked around. Time felt different here, slower, wider. No one asked anything of him. No one needed him to explain where he'd been. He was simply allowed to be. After a while, he rose again and selected a thin book. Nothing heavy, nothing urgent, just something that felt right. He carried it to the checkout desk, the card warm in his hand. As he left the library, the afternoon light greeted him once more. But something had changed. The world felt a little quieter, a little kinder, as if time itself had softened, just enough to let him step back into a place he had never truly left. Mr. Ellis walked home at the same unhurried pace, the thin book tucked carefully under his arm. It wasn't heavy, not in weight, not in meaning either, just enough to be felt. The sidewalk looked the same as it had earlier that afternoon, but somehow, it felt different beneath his feet. The cracks in the pavement seemed less sharp. The distance between each step felt easier to cross. A breeze moved through the trees overhead, carrying with it the sound of leaves brushing together. Mr. Ellis slowed for a moment, not because he was tired, but because he wanted to listen. He passed the same chalk drawing near the corner, now smudged slightly by footsteps. It made him smile, the quiet kind that doesn't ask to be noticed. By the time he reached his street, the sun had shifted lower in the sky. Light spilled across the houses at an angle, softening their edges, making everything appear gentler than before. Mr. Ellis unlocked his door and stepped inside. The house greeted him with its familiar stillness, but it didn't feel quite as empty as it had earlier. He set the book down on the kitchen table, straightening it so it rested neatly near the window. Then he removed his jacket and hung it carefully by the door. For a moment, he simply stood there, hands resting at his sides, as if listening for something new in the quiet. The radio clicked on with a soft hum, filling the room with low jazz notes that drifted easily through the air. He hadn't planned to turn it on. It just felt like the right thing to do. Mr. Ellis returned to the porch and sat in his usual chair. The same one, the same position. But the afternoon light felt warmer now, lingering longer on the wooden floor. Toby, the stray cat, appeared from nowhere and curled up near his feet, settling in as if he'd been waiting. Mr. Ellis glanced down and smiled again. He picked up the book and opened it slowly, careful not to bend the spine. The pages smelled faintly of paper and time. He read a few lines, then paused, letting the words settle before continuing. There was no urgency to finish, no reason to rush. Every so often, he looked up from the page, at the yard, at the maple tree, at the quiet street beyond the porch. The world hadn't changed dramatically. Nothing had been fixed or solved. And yet, something within him felt lighter, as if a small window had been opened somewhere inside, letting in air he hadn't realized he'd been missing. When the light finally began to fade, Mr. Ellis closed the book and placed it gently beside him. He sat there for a while longer, listening to the music, feeling the weight of the day settle softly around him. Some afternoons, he thought, don't arrive to make a point. They come simply to remind us that we are still allowed to carry new things home, even when we thought our hands were already full. Evening arrived without ceremony. The light on the porch softened first, sliding gently away from the floorboards, and settling into the quiet spaces between things. The air cooled just enough to be noticed, carrying with it the familiar promise of night. Mr. Ellis remained in his chair, the book resting closed on the small table beside him. He hadn't felt the need to keep reading. It was enough to know it was there. Across the street, a porch light flicked on, then another, farther down the block. One by one, the neighborhood exhaled into evening. Mr. Ellis watched without thinking much about it. Some moments didn't need to be held on to. They passed best when left undisturbed. Toby stirred near his feet, stretching lazily before settling again. Mr. Ellis shifted slightly, making room without looking down. They had learned each other's rhythms that way. The radio inside continued to play softly, the notes drifting through the open door and out onto the porch. They didn't demand attention. They simply filled the space where silence had been. Mr. Ellis rested his hands on his knees and leaned back. His body felt tired in the honest way, not worn out, just ready. He thought about the library again, not the shelves or the desk or the quiet voices, but the feeling of stepping inside, of being welcomed without explanation. It had surprised him, how little it took. A card, a door, a moment of choosing not to turn back. He hadn't reclaimed anything dramatic that afternoon. No lost years, no grand part of himself, just a small piece of who he had always been. The sky deepened into a soft blue, then slowly darkened further. A single star appeared, faint but steady. Mr. Ellis smiled to himself. Life, he realized, didn't always announce what it was giving back. Sometimes it offered things quietly, tucking them into ordinary afternoons, and waiting to see if we would notice. The library card rested safely in his wallet now, not as a reminder of the past, but as a simple invitation. There when he needed it, patient when he didn't. He stood carefully, stretching his back, and carried the book inside. It found its place on the table near the window, where the morning light would reach it again. Before turning off the porch light, Mr. Ellis paused and looked out one last time. The street was calm, the night gentle. He felt no need to rush tomorrow, or the day after that. Some things, he understood now, aren't lost when we set them down. They don't expire. They don't fade away. They wait, quietly, faithfully, until we're ready to pick them up again. Mr. Ellis closed the door softly behind him, and the night, like the day before it, held him with care.